Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Zankowski, the Agricultural Science Leader in the Office of the Chief Scientist. Thank you for taking the time to help us think more about the future of plant breeding and USDA's role. I wish that we could get together in person, but through the virtual environment, we're able to reach out across the miles and time zones. This stakeholder meeting is unique in that on the meeting website, we provided you with pre-recorded presentations that have given overviews from USDA's leadership, agency updates, and thought-provoking keynote presentations on matters important in the plant breeding realm. I'll talk more about this later. We've also provided 4 presentations on 5 different breakout topics, along with a website for comment gathering. We'll also discuss this more later. We thought this would be an efficient way to highlight USDA's plant breeding accomplishments, as well as characterizing USDA's role in plant breeding. Based on the comments that have been gathered from the website, in addition to our discussions today, we would like to prioritize your plant breeding needs and ultimately create a USDA plant breeding blueprint that will help the USDA future breeding activities. Through the pre-recorded presentations and discussions today, we've highlighted the importance of plant breeding for climate adaptation. We want to hear your input on public-private breeding partnerships and help us identify priorities relative to both the USDA Science Blueprint and the Ag Innovation Agenda. Additionally, genome editing and genomic techniques will have a role for plant breeders, which may be subject to federal regulations. But first, let's discuss the plan for today's meeting. We'll have introductions, a summary of stakeholder comments, breakout sessions, a report back from the breakouts, and the meeting wrap-up and next steps. I wanted to provide you with a brief recaps of the 4 USDA agencies working in plant breeding. All of the pre-recorded agency updates, keynote presentations, and presentations related to the breakout topics are still available for viewing at the stakeholder meeting website that's indicated below. ARS is the Agricultural Research Service, which has a very active intramural breeding program featuring many release varieties, tools to optimize breeding, and a national germplasm system that is first-rate, just to name a few points. In a different perspective, the U.S. Forest Service breeding program has great challenges to breed trees that are long-lived, must be durable over time, have to deal with changing climates, and have very complex genetics. NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, is USDA's extramural funding agency that supports foundational as well as applied plant breeding and cultivar development. NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, through its network of plant material centers, selects and tests plants for specific natural resource conservation functions to prevent erosion, to improve soil, water, and air quality. I'd like to give you a brief overview of the 7 keynote presentations. 3 of these discuss the challenges of breeding for climate adaptation. There is also a presentation on how breeding innovation has driven productivity and the topic of breeding for food safety, finishing up with new breeding techniques and how the regulatory landscape may impact plant breeding. Larry Purcell discussed projections for climate change that would shift growing zones more than 200 miles north from today's zones, and the complications of weather extremes and ozone damage. He presented a study on delayed wilting and how soybean can adapt to drought. From the forestry perspective, Chris Fittig discussed tree breeding for climate adaptation and native pest resistance, and the possibility that tree genotypes may already exist to adapt to climate change, but that those natural populations may be in the wrong place. Ed Buckler provided a broad historical perspective of breeding, starting with early farmers who selected the best plants from a diverse population, so-called breeding 1.0, to today's advancement of genome editing and molecular design under breeding 4.0, with an emphasis on climate change. Jeff Graham described how breeding innovations and 100 years of selection in maize have resulted in farmers growing more on less land, and through breeding population development, field and digital phenotyping and predictive analytics continue to drive genetic potential higher. Miley Mulatto discussed the possibilities of plant breeding for food safety and discussed the breeding successes for fusarium head blight of wheat and aspergillus on maize, and the possibilities of reducing human pathogens on produce by developing leafy green cultivars that deter their persistence. Zach Lipman discusses how mutations through genome editing in tomato flowering genes can change plant architecture, size, and yield in a short time frame compared to traditional breeding for the same traits. Lastly, Fanley Cho presented the regulatory landscape for plant breeding and genome editing from a domestic and international perspective. If you haven't had an opportunity to view these presentations, please check out the Stakeholder Meeting website where you can find all these and more.
Good afternoon, everyone. We received feedback from 35 stakeholders representing academia, industry, and commodity groups. Thank you for your comments. We carefully read all of the feedback, and I'm going to summarize some of the key points. You will have the opportunity to provide additional feedback during the following breakout sessions. Our first question was, considering that public sector research is underfunded, are there ways that the private sector and commodity organizations might partner with the USDA during the next 5 to 10 years to maximize efficiency and breeding impact from public sector plant breeding investments? There was a consensus that federal funding can and should focus on long-term objectives, fundamental principles, high-risk research, and education, which complements private breeding efforts. For example, essential gene introgression program available to both sectors could maximize advancement while optimizing costs. Crops with smaller national research resources need coordinated efforts that could be organized by the USDA. Facilitating communication and workshops were suggested as ways to bring together researchers. Wheat and table grape breeding programs working with the USDA were mentioned as good examples. We would like to hear more about what makes those programs successful and suggestions for how that can be applied to other programs. There are concerns that smaller scale crops do not benefit as much from these partnerships, and the focus is too much on large commodities. Tree breeding also has challenges that require long-term investment, which brings things, which are things to consider in the discussion. We have some additional questions for the breakout sessions. How can we balance between large commodities while also supporting breeding programs for smaller scale crops? What are the best ways to structure partnerships? Should this differ between different crops? And how can partnerships be implemented? Our second question was, considering that plant breeding is a shared responsibility between the public and private sectors, how should these responsibilities and obligations be divided during the next 5 to 10 years? Many of the responders thought that the USDA should focus on long-term or basic research. This is an area that the private sector relies on, but often does not fund. This may include broad-based technologies, disease resistance, as well as a focus on small-scale crops and forest trees. The private sector can develop regional cultivars, major field crops and ornamentals, as well as some traditional breeding operations. There is room for collaboration on cover and orphan crops. We received comments that the USDA should support areas where private companies are not competing and release new varieties for growers. If the market is competitive, the USDA should enhance private sector impact through research grants and germplasm development. Our additional questions to focus on in the discussion are, what are some public-private sector plant breeding responsibilities that have the potential to show quicker turnaround and results? How can public sector plant breeding best be prioritized to avoid duplication with private breeding? Our third question is, are there plant breeding synergies between the public and private sectors and allied agencies, such as commodity organizations, effective, and how can they be improved? There was consensus that synergies among groups for large commodity crops such as wheat and corn are effective. Genomes to fields was listed as an example for corn. Also effective for oats, leafy greens, and some fruits and nuts, as well as instrumental for the California table grapes industry. There is also extensive support for the USDA germplasm collections and a recommendation to increase efforts in this area. We received recommendations to improve in the areas of forest health and tree breeding, and more could be done for orphan crops. There are concerns that breeding synergies are being eroded between public and some private sectors. There is no longer transparency of genetic backgrounds, which limits breeding programs. There are also comments on how best to provide a return on public funding for domestic growers. We'd like to follow up on how best to improve existing synergies, form new ones, and how can the best examples serve as templates for other crops. Question 4. Does USDA's role in education and mentorship produce value, and is it adequately balanced with the main activities of the various USDA agencies that practice or facilitate plant breeding? How can USDA education and mentorship be improved during the next 5 to 10 years? There is widespread agreement that the USDA offers a valuable resource for training the next generation of plant breeders. There is agreement that the USDA should continue to supplement university training through grants, internships, and collaborations. And this is certainly something that I benefited from, having been mentored by USDA scientists during my PhD and supported by USDA funding. We received comments that the USDA scientists should be incentivized to mentor or even contribute to university courses on plant breeding, which are lacking at some land-grant universities. Some of the suggested areas that require additional focus include forest tree breeding, pest and pathology, quantitative genetics, and education requirements on grants. Given the need for future plant breeders, how can the profession be better promoted? What USDA education and mentorship roles are most effective? Finally, question 5. What specific plant breeding goals should the USDA pursue during the next 5 to 6 years? And how should USDA deliver plant breeding products with regard to intellectual property, technology transfer, and partnerships with public and private sectors? We received specific goals for tree breeding, wheat, soybeans, table grapes, and others, which can be further explored in the breakout rooms. Across crops, some of the major goals involved advancements in understanding the function of genes, machine learning, crop modeling, prediction methods, climate resilience, and support of GM traits. There are recommendations for a centralized database for germplasm information and restrictions searchable by trait. Advancements in genomic selection methods and germplasm mining using modern genomic technologies were also mentioned as major goals. For IP and tech transfer, several of the commenters see this as a challenge. There is support for multiple paths for IP and tech transfer depending on the value to taxpayers, producers, and consumers. Some think that the current system of plant variety protections through universities and licensing is working well, and Crops of the Future program was listed as an example in which IP issues are addressed. However, there are concerns that the lack of IP protections for varieties and technology developed with public sector funding could lead to companies obtaining IP protections for similar technology and restrict use. So there is support for IP protections if it helps US growers, but we need to find the right balance in this area. During the breakout sessions, we would like to brainstorm some of the examples of short, medium, and long-term goals for crops. And given the challenge of IP and tech transfer, how can the USDA help ensure the most benefits and the least hardships between the public and private sectors? We have questions relevant to all the breakout groups. We would like feedback on the role of new breeding tools, the impact of federal regulations on the future of plant breeding, and what are some important steps for fulfilling the agricultural innovation agenda goal of increasing production by 40% while cutting the environmental footprint in half by 2050. Our USDA Science Blueprint lays out some steps to move forward, such as accelerating breeding programs to bring superior varieties to market, and tapping into genetic diversity using genomic technology. What other strategies should be implemented? Next, everyone will be divided into breakout rooms for further discussion, and we're going to explain how that will work. Thank you for your attention, and we hope you enjoy the discussion in the breakout rooms.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. We want to take just a few minutes to just hear a few of the highlights that came out of the different breakout sessions, and also want to remind you that if you weren't able to participate in a breakout session or a topic that you were very interested in, I know we assigned you randomly. Paul is going to send out his email in the chat, or we'll make sure that everybody, as a follow-up email, has contact information. So we invite you to submit any additional feedback to Paul and the USDA team. So we'll invite you to do that. I'll kick us off with our first breakout session, which was around partnerships. And I certainly won't be able to do this justice on the fly, but we had a really good diverse group, good discussion, and a lot of feedback. And we did hear that the summary of feedback that was received in the comments was in most cases just spot on. So a lot of really affirmation of what came in through the comments. There were some suggestions around the USDA looking at regional partnerships, thinking about how to form partnerships across states, thinking about how to invest in people and grad students as a way to help build partnerships in different sectors. The importance of communication and how can that be facilitated to help support partnerships. Some smaller crop sectors may not have the ability to form partnerships or have private sector partners. So there may be a role for the USDA to provide additional funding or resources to help support that. I think I'll just to wrap up with, again, I think with partnerships, there's really not a one size fits all. There are a lot of really good examples, and some of these are highlighted in this group's notes. It's really important to look at each individual group and figure out how best to approach it, both across sectors and both large and small. So again, really appreciate our group's input and feedback. And what we'd like to do is just to shift to the second group, which was dividing plant breeding responsibilities between public sector and private sector. And I'll turn it over to Shelley Grogg.
Hi, everyone. So like Warren said, it's hard to give justice to a full conversation in just a few moments. And so we had a lot of really rich conversation. As you can see, we had new questions that came out of the initial questions, and a lot of conversation. And so I think some of the main takeaways and the points that were brought up a number of times were around really the need for long-term sustained funding, and how that can be a gap that for the USDA to fill. And in particular, that came up in many ways, but especially related to trees, given the long-term nature of the sorts of research and development that need to go into that. We also had discussions around some quicker turnarounds and results related to whether that's marker-assisted breeding, reliable reference genomes, and indoor controlled environment testings. We also discussed the differences of how to not be duplicative with private sector breeding, and the resounding answer from the group was it depends on the crop. And really there being a need to convene experts in the specific crop or plant or tree variety in order to really understand the needs within that specific group. And also the need for the USDA to really keep their ear to the ground and know what's coming, to know that if private sector funding is going to be leaving or attention is going to be leaving, that they're able to jump in to avoid the potential challenge of that market collapsing if they don't have the support that they're used to from the private sector. So this is constantly changing, and it's different for every crop. So kind of a hard target for just one answer. I think that those were some of the main pieces that came out. We also talked about domestication of crops, in particular cover crops, or changing needs of nutritional needs and goals of the country, as well as changes in diets and how those might have some impacts, and also just utilization of existing crops and breeding for public good and sustainability. And with that, I will pass it on to Group 3.
Great. We'll turn it over to Maddie Shea to give us some of the highlights from breakout question 3, which was effectiveness of plant breeding synergies between public and private sector and allied agencies. Maddie?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Warren. So we had a really great discussion. Again, we talked about the synergies between public and private sector, and what problems there are and how it could be improved. Some of the things that we talked about were royalties, and how the public sector, and I want to make sure I captured this correctly, but how the public sector, if the model continues as it is, focusing on pre-breeding, their support might start to go away. We also talked about exchange of material across the germplasm, and making sure that it's not one way, and that there's flexibility as well with intellectual property for just sharing any information, sharing material. Some people talked about how years ago it might take a day or two, and now the process can take up to a couple of weeks. We also talked about just, I think Shelley mentioned too, keeping their ear to the ground and just making sure that there's regular communication and it's not just focused on grants, but just having a pulse check and knowing what's going on with our different commodities. We also talked about some different interesting funding models. We had someone from the hops industry who talks about how the industry is actually involved with them, a model where selling profits from the beer actually goes back into funding this research. And we also talked about a tree improvement project at NC State that also partners with private companies and how they retain ownership of their genetic material, but then they fund the research. So we just talked about how there's different potential funding models and more traditional grant programs that might work and increase flexibility between the different sectors.
Great.
Yeah, it was a great discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Maddie. So we'll go over to our breakout question number 4, the USDA's role in plant breeding education and mentorship. So we'll hear from our facilitator, Madeline.
Thank you. Well, as you can see from our board here too, we had a great discussion. It was really great to see how the questions kind of built on each other and how our participants in this group also built on the answers from each other. So thank you everyone for a very fruitful discussion. We really talked about the importance of having partnerships with students, and something that got repeatedly mentioned was not just working with graduate and undergraduate students, but also focusing on the K-12 education and how adapting that curriculum could help propel students into these careers as they go to college and graduate school. This is where the questions connected here, where people said that USDA does a great job with the graduate students, but there's room for improvement, focusing on younger students and internships and for students of younger ages. We also talked about how we have to adapt to the different markets. So with smaller markets, sometimes those smaller changes work, and really also highlighting the success stories that we have. And one way to do that could be through the social media, and just making sure that public is aware of the successes that plant breeders are having, and especially when it comes to the public sector and how those successes and getting that information out a little bit quicker. We also talked about collaborating with other groups, including the NAPB and other organizations for public-private partnerships within the industry. And within a way that it could be more effective is focusing on on-ramping and when for younger colleagues, when the older colleagues are leaving the profession, so that there's more of a sharing of knowledge that way. So yeah, that was a very great discussion.
Great, thanks, Madeline. We'll go to our 5th breakout, just giving you the highlights here. USDA's future plant breeding goals and tech transfer, IP delivery. So I'll turn it over to Paige Pate to walk us through some highlights.
Yes, we had a great discussion, and it's actually very interesting to hear particularly the first 3 groups questions. A lot of those responses carry over into part of our discussion as well. With regard to examples of short, medium, and long-term goals for the crop, there is a lot of discussion just around biotech and the regulations, and just how that negotiating of them can be very difficult no matter what industry you're in. They also talked about the fact that there needs to be some flexibility. Like, we recently have faced some shortages with regard to everything going on with COVID, and the flexibility of the crops and being able to utilize different methods, whether it be labor shortages or the harvesting of things, that how they could re-engage in a more proactive way. With regard to IP and technology transfer, it was very interesting that the overwhelming response that we came back with was it needs to be easier and it needs to be crystal clear, that intellectual properties are often very, very complicated, and the best way to avoid those complications is to be crystal clear when you're writing the agreements. But on top of that, it's also there was an overwhelming response to really make sure that the environment was very inclusive for innovation, so that these new ideas can really come to be. And so one suggestion was making these agreements more streamlined so that it can be an easier road to navigate. With regards to strategies for climate adaptation, there really was a lot of different feedback, but really the fact that germplasm characterization was touched on quite a bit, how we need to look at profiles and make sure that everybody is looking at the characterization and that we're looking at it from various different perspectives, whether it be the climate, the soil, that type of thing. One of the pieces that was mentioned a few times was that climate adaptation can be defined in many different ways. And so there was question of what should the USDA really be focusing on in that. As we moved through, and it was touched on earlier as well, there was a lot of comments and concerns about funding and resources and being able to share those, being able to exchange information for the good of all. So if you have, like we talked about, a mega resource of information, and ensuring that that was able to be shared across entities. And then we did talk about funding as well. And the fact that, for instance, in forest tree breeding, that the work may take longer than the 5 years, and that the funding grant may be limited and may not show the results. And just that is a frustration, and that might be missing some opportunities there.
Great.
It was a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. So again, just wanted to give you some quick highlights, and all of the information that's compiled from these sessions will be it will be compiled and available. So I would like to now turn it back over to Paul Zinkowski for final thoughts and next steps.
Thanks, Warren. And thank you to everyone for participating in the breakout sessions, and especially for the facilitators for the summaries of those sessions. We'll be using the comments that were gathered from the website along with today's comments to begin crafting a plant breeding blueprint. Next slide. We'll make sure that all the comments are finalized by early next year, including those that were gathered from the website as well as those from today. The USDA's Plant Breeding Working Group, which is made up of representatives from all the various agencies dealing with plant breeding, will evaluate the comments and discuss the plant breeding targets for the short, medium, and long terms. Based on that input, we plan to complete a blueprint draft by about March of 21. Next slide. The blueprint would move through the briefing and approval process from the USDA Chief Scientist, the REE, the Research, Education, and Economic Deputy Undersecretary, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and other USDA science leadership. We plan on posting the blueprint on the Office of the Chief Scientist website, along with the final communication, and notify the stakeholders of the posting by the spring of 2021. Next slide. The tentative structure of the blueprint would summarize the website and stakeholder input in order to provide future direction for the 4 primary USDA agencies that are involved in plant breeding: ARS, NIFA, and NRCS. And the last slide. We've recorded today's presentations and will be posting the recording on the Office of Chief Scientist website. Please feel free to contact me at my email, paul.zankowski@usda.gov, to provide any additional input or comments. This brings us to the end of today's session. Thanks again to everyone for taking the time to discuss the future of USDA plant breeding. And please stay healthy, safe, and have a good day. Thanks, everyone.